Welcome to DLS's Teacher Training Module, Introduction to Learning Style Preferences. Let's get started. Let's look at the objectives for this module. By the end of the module, you will understand different learning styles, identify personal learning styles, understand how personal learning styles affect language learning, teamwork, and study habits, adjust and balance learning styles to accommodate different kinds of language learning and study tasks. Let's talk about learning styles. A learning style is an individual's natural, habitual, and preferred way of processing and retaining information and skills. Learning styles are usually constant and predictable, but they can change. A learning style is an appropriate characterization of how an individual behaves in general, but they may use different learning styles in specific contexts. For example, learning styles can change over time or depending on the type of information we teach. A student might use one style to learn to ride a motorcycle and another style to learn a language. Most people lean one way, and it is our job to understand the preferences, but to make sure that the student does not lean too heavily on just one style. Leaning too heavily on one style can make a lopsided or uneven student. We will talk more about this at the end of the presentation. Here are the different learning style preferences. Processing preference. This can be either active or reflective. Reception preference. This can be verbal or visual. Sensory preference is sensory or intuitive. Overall learning orientation, global or sequential. Next, we'll talk about each of these preferences and how different learners experience them. First, let's discuss processing preferences. Different learners process information in different ways. Some people process information in an active way. For those people, it helps to participate in physical activities or discussions related to the material. On the other hand, reflective learners often do better interacting with material quietly or on their own. Students who prefer to process material in an active way can also be referred to as hands-on learners. Active learners usually remember and understand information better when they can do something active with the material. An active learner might enjoy making flashcards or discussing an idea with others. They are often excited about trying out and experimenting with new information. Active learners may move around a lot, tap their pencil, or stand up in class. They like working with objects they can touch, like collages and flashcards. Sometimes active learners have trouble concentrating in places that are too quiet. They usually like noisy classrooms and physical interaction. On the other hand, reflective learners prefer to think quietly about information before applying it. They typically sit and think things through before acting. You may have had students in the past who needed complete quiet and like to spend time thinking before trying something new. That is typical of reflective learners. These learners may have trouble concentrating in more active or dynamic learning environments and prefer to work through problems on their own rather than participate in group discussion. Sensory preferences can be either intuitive or sensory. Sensory learners like to be able to relate what they are learning to things they can sense or tie to the real world. Students who enjoy memorizing facts and having all the information they need available are usually sensory learners. Intuitive learners like discovering things for themselves and usually don't like to have things repeated. An example of an intuitive learner would be a student who's always eager to move on to the next thing. A sensory learner likes learning facts and solving problems using well-established methods. Sensory learners like reviewing familiar topics, and they need to be able to connect what they're learning in class to the real world. Telling these students how they can use what they are learning in the real world can help them stay interested in class. Sensory learners usually do not like being tested on material that has not been covered in class. They are patient with details and good at memorizing facts. They like hands-on work. They're also careful and practical. Intuitive learners prefer to discover possibilities and relationships. They use their intuition to come up with their own ideas about how things work or how ideas might be related. Intuitive learners like new things and are usually good at understanding new concepts. They are more comfortable with abstract ideas and are often fast workers. They dislike doing the same thing over and over again. They dislike lessons that are too rigid and not flexible. Reception preference is another learning preference, which can be either verbal or visual. Verbal learners learn better through hearing information. Visual learners, on the other hand, prefer to see information. You may have had students in the past that frequently asked you to write down information or show you how something works. Those students are usually visual learners. Visual learners like to read or write information. They usually ask to see something written down or may take a lot of notes during class. If you tell them something but do not write it down, they may have trouble remembering it. Visual learners are usually very good at reading or writing tasks. They may try to imagine spoken words as written down in their minds. In contrast, verbal learners prefer receiving information through words, listening, or reading, and may become impatient with written work in class. Verbal learners are the kinds of students who prefer speaking practice, and you may have had verbal learners in the past who read out loud to themselves or practice out loud before saying something. They may become fluent early in the course and usually do not take a lot of notes. They may even ask you for extra listening comprehension practice. Finally, learners' overall orientation may be sequential or global. Overall orientation is how students process information to gain understanding of a higher level concept. Sequential learners, or learners that prefer to learn bit by bit, need to be taught information in smaller steps. If you have ever had a student who wanted to know all the smaller parts of something first and then build up to the main idea, you have taught a sequential learner. Global learners focus on the bigger picture. They like to think about the main idea first and learn the smaller parts later. Sequential learners, who can also be called analytic learners, prefer to learn from the bottom up, learning the details and structure first. These learners prefer to learn details about grammar or individual rules one at a time. This can cause them to lag behind the other type, global learners, in the beginning. Sequential learners prefer logic, rules, and accuracy. They like to be right. They also prefer step-by-step, logical instruction, and putting information into categories. These learners tend to use the dictionary a lot, and they like to know every single word. They do not like not knowing something, and they don't like to take risks. They avoid activities that don't have a lot of structure. On the other hand, global learners like to learn about the big picture first. This is also called top-down learning. They are comfortable taking risks and guessing. They are often not as accurate, and their grammar can be sloppy. Global learners are more concerned with being understood and communicating their message than in saying something that is 100% correct. They do not like repetition and using language out of context. They are comfortable guessing when they do not know the answer and tend to speak before they think, so they may say something and then correct themselves. They are usually ahead of sequential learners in the beginning. The chart shown here looks at two different types of learners, fluent students and accurate students. In just a moment, we will talk about the learning preferences that these two types of learners have, but notice that the fluent students quickly reach level 1, but around level 1 plus or 2, improving becomes much more difficult. Accurate students have a harder time reaching level 1, but eventually have a much easier time reaching level 2 or 2 plus. Fluent learners and accurate learners each have a different set of the preferences we discussed earlier. Fluent learners are verbal. They learn better through hearing information. They are active, so they prefer to move around and do things when learning. They are intuitive, which means they like to find connections between ideas themselves. Fluent learners are also global learners and like to start by learning the main idea or big picture. Accurate learners, on the other hand, are visual and learn through seeing or writing information. They are reflective, meaning they like to think through information. Accurate learners are also sensing and like to relate what they learn to the real world or to things they can sense. They are also sequential, so they like to learn the smaller parts of something before moving on to the bigger picture. Now let's take another look at the graph from earlier. Think about the two types of learners that were just described. Remember, fluent learners can reach a level 1 or 1+ pretty quickly, but have a harder time later in their lessons reaching a level 2 or 2+. They are helped at the beginning because they are more focused with being understood than always saying everything correctly. But that makes things harder for them when accuracy matters more. They tend to struggle with specific grammar rules and other smaller elements of a language. Accurate students are exactly the opposite. They have a harder time getting to level 1, but things usually get easier for them later on. This is because they often want to learn every rule first and are worried about avoiding errors. This helps them later on once they have mastered the basics, because paying close attention to smaller details comes naturally to them. Most learners will show qualities of both, but these two types of students can be helpful to have in mind when you are trying to figure out exactly what learning styles will work best for your student. Keep in mind that if a student is lopsided or leans too heavily on one side, you may need to push him or her gently to use a style they are less comfortable with. To conclude, be sure you know your students' learning preferences. Many people don't fit exactly into the preference categories we discussed today, but fall along a continuum. Remember to be flexible and try different ways to reach your learner. That concludes DLS's teacher training module on learning preferences. If you have any questions about this presentation, please reach out to your language training supervisor.